In this lesson, our focus is going to be on the muscular system. And this system is a system of muscles, and its primary responsibility is going to be for movement, and that will be both voluntary and involuntary movement. Now, as we start to talk about muscle types, we have three different muscle types that we do recognize. The first of those is skeletal muscle, and there's a picture of that shown right here. Skeletal muscle, one of the characteristics of it is that it does tend to have lines or striations in it, so that's where the term striated comes from. And if we talk a little bit more about the skeletal muscle, this is going to attach to the body skeleton, and that's really where the name comes from. This is going to form the smoother contours of the body, so that's why we are not just jagged edges like our skeleton would be. The cells that we have that make up the skeletal muscle, they're going to be huge. These are very large cigar-shaped cells, and they're also going to be multinucleated, which means that they have many nuclei inside of them. Another thing about it is that these are subject to voluntary control. That means that we are capable of moving them when we want to move them. So if we were just to throw three terms in here to describe skeletal muscles, they are skeletal, striated, and voluntary. So that's muscle type number one. So why don't our muscles rip apart when we use them? So when we're exerting a lot of power with our muscles? Well, the reason for that is that our muscles are made up of fibers, and these fibers contain a lot of cells which have been carefully bundled together. And that's what we're seeing in the image right here. These individual cells, you can see them here, they're very long, slender cells, and we'll have a bunch of these that are packaged together. And when they're packaged together, they're held together by a special structure, which you can see here is called the perimecium. So this is going to hold them in a bundle, and then we'll have a bunch of those bundles that are kind of tied together and bundled together into a larger bundle, and they're going to be bundled up with the epimecium. So that's right here. And so all of that together is our muscle. And this is going to blend into tendons and then also into aponeurises. And so if we look at this, the tendons, they're going to anchor the muscles. They provide durability, and then they're also going to conserve space. The aponeurises, these are going to attach to muscles indirectly, and they're going to connect them to bones, cartilage, and connective tissue coverings. Some describing terms that we can use for the skeletal muscle is that, first of all, it's extremely powerful. So our muscles are powerful, but the downside to that is that they are going to tire very easily. So this is not something that we're going to be able to use and exert huge amounts of power over a really long time frame. Muscle type number two is going to be the smooth muscle. You can see that in the image here. And right away, it does look pretty different from the skeletal muscle because this one does not have the striations in it. So it doesn't have the lines or the stripes. The smooth muscle is found primarily in the walls of hollow visceral organs. And it's going to be made up of spindle-shaped, single nucleated cells. So they're spindle-shaped, and they will have just a single nucleus, which is what we're seeing in the image right here. This is another look at the smooth muscle. This smooth muscle is going to be arranged in layers, and we're typically talking about two layers that are making it up, and you can see both of those layers represented in this specific diagram, and this is going to be subject to involuntary control. So this means that this will be automatic control of these. We will not be thinking about it and specifically moving these particular muscles. The main describing terms that we can apply to the smooth muscle are it's visceral, it's going to be non-striated, and it's going to be involuntary movement. Other characteristics, this is going to change the shape or the size of organs because it is going to have a slow, sustained contraction ability to it. And again, this is found in the walls of hollow visceral organs, so this is going to be things like the bladder or the uterus. Our third type of muscle is cardiac muscle, and there's really just one location where we find cardiac muscle, and that's going to be in the heart. Cardiac muscle, it's made up of branching cells, so there's a good representation of that branching cell right here, and these branching cells are connected together by junctions. We call those junctions intercalated disc, and you can see in the image that the cardiac muscle, it is striated. It does have the lines in there, similar to what we have with the skeletal muscle. And there will be a spindle arrangement of the muscle bundles when we're talking about the cardiac muscle. It is very much going to be involuntary control here, which is important because our heart needs to contract continuously. So we don't have to think about that because it is the involuntary control here. 3 words to describe the cardiac muscle are going to be cardiac, striated, and involuntary. So this table is just going to give us an overview of the 3 different muscle types that we've already gone over, give us an idea of where they happen to be found, what they look like, and in general whether it's voluntary control or whether it's involuntary control. We had 2 types of striated muscle. That was the cardiac and then also the skeletal muscle. And then we had 2 types of involuntary movement, and that's going to be the cardiac and the smooth muscle. Now, if we talk about the overall muscle system, the muscular system, this is something that's going to apply specifically to the skeletal muscle. So we're now going to shift our focus to talking just about the skeletal muscle. The functions of the muscular system are first off to produce some movement. So this is going to help us to move. It will provide mobility to our bodies, and it's also going to enable quick responses to different things that happen in our environment. So it's going to enable us to respond quickly. Also, it allows for expression of emotions because we will have a lot of facial muscles that do contribute to those facial expressions that we get. Besides movement, this is important for maintaining the overall posture and body position. What we mean by this is that it is going to be responsible for making continuous adjustments to counteract the effects of gravity. So gravity is always affecting our bodies, and we have to kind of pay attention to that and remain upright and counteract those effects. The muscle system is going to be responsible for stabilizing joints and also for generating heat. And the heat that's generated is going to be generated by muscle contraction, and this is very important for maintaining our normal body temperature. If we look at the actual skeletal muscle and we were to look at a cell that makes up the skeletal muscle, as we mentioned before, it is going to be a multinucleated cell. So as a multinucleated cell, there will be multiple nuclei inside of there. We do see several of them in this image. We've got one right here. Here would be a second one. Here would be a third one. So they can actually have quite a lot of nuclei inside of them. And these muscle cells are going to be made up of these special organelles, which we call myofibrils. These myofibrils are going to be contractile units. We will call them sarcomeres. And so there'll be a lot of those. You can see them packed in here inside of this skeletal muscle cell. Just a ton of them. They're really long and slender, and this is going to make for a really long and slender overall skeletal muscle cell. If we look at this in a little bit more detail, if we look at that myofibril is going to have kind of striations within it. So that's the striations that we see in the cells. And that's because there's light bands and there's dark bands, and those are made up of different proteins. We have actin microfilaments, and then we also have myosin microfilaments, and they look a little different. So we do see the striations there. And these are what is responsible for the actual contraction that we see with our muscle cells. Now, if we talk about the microfibrils, these microfibrils, they're going to be interconnected together. This is going to be accomplished by the sarcoplasmic reticulum, or what we commonly call the SR, and that is responsible for a lot of calcium storage. The functional properties of the muscle cells are irritability, contractibility, extensibility, and then also elasticity. So all of these are very important functional properties. So if we talk about the irritability part of it, irritability is defined as the ability to receive and respond to a stimulus. And this is something that's very important for our muscle system. So this receiving and responding is going to require the coordinated actions of what we call a motor unit. And that motor unit is made up of a number of different pieces. Part of it is going to be nervous system, and we do have the muscle system also interacting there. Within this, we will have axons. Those axons are going to connect to the sarcolemma in the neuromuscular junctions, and these junctions will contain vesicles, special vesicles that will be filled up with neurotransmitters. So those are going to be helping us to receive and respond to those stimuli. Now, if we talk about the actual process, how it's going to work and what the individual steps are, if we look right here, we have a nerve cell and we see a nerve impulse that's going to be traveling down that. So nerve impulses, what they do is they specifically cause a release of calcium ions. So we will have this stimulation which will cause a release of calcium ions, which means that there's going to be this overall flow of calcium ions into this cell. Now, when those calcium ions release into the cell, so these are the little purple circles that we see in the image, that release of calcium is going to stimulate or cause the release of a second chemical, which is called acetylcholine, and we abbreviate that ACH. That acetylcholine gets released from the synaptic vesicles, which are all the little bubbles that you see in the picture here. So inside of them, if we just label it, inside of them is where we have that acetylcholine. The calcium being released there is going to stimulate the release of the acetylcholine. The next step is that the acetylcholine is going to diffuse, and it's going to diffuse across the synaptic cleft, and as it diffuses across the synaptic cleft, it's going to attach to receptors. So this synaptic cleft that we're talking about, it is a little space, so it is a tiny space between cells. And so it has to be small because we want these molecules to just diffuse really quickly over this tight little distance. And so we will have acetylcholine released by this cell, and it's going to be detected when it binds to the receptors on the other side of the cleft. These receptors, once they bind the acetylcholine, they are going to allow sodium ions to enter the muscle cell, and they will allow potassium ions to exit the muscle cell. So we are going to have an exchange of ions once we do have binding of that neurotransmitter. And when we get this, we get an overall action potential. And that action potential is generated, and this electrical impulse is then going to cause the overall muscle contraction, which is the result of the irritability. Now, the acetylcholine is going to get broken down after we have used it for this particular action potential, and that breaking down of the acetylcholine is going to stop that overall contraction process. When we look at the overall skeletal muscle activity, it's easy to think of it as a fire or a wildfire that happens to be spreading. So that's what the first image is showing here, that you have an igniting on one end of the twig, and that very rapidly spreads to the other end of the twig. That's what we have when we're talking about our muscle cells. Basically, with these motor units, we get a stimulation on one end, and then very rapidly that is going to spread throughout. So the action potential is going to spread from the initial starting site to the other end of the cell. Now, if we talk about the mechanism, how this actually takes place, one of the common theories is what we call the sliding filament theory. And if we look at the sliding filament theory, it's basically looking at the relaxed sarcomere and comparing that to the fully contracted sarcomere. And the idea is that you have the myosin and the actin filaments basically sliding against each other. And we can see that here with the myosin in red, and we've got the actin in blue. And if you look at the top picture, we see that they're not very well aligned with each other. So here is the blue, and it doesn't overlap as much of the actin. But if you compare that to what we have on the bottom, you can see that those actin filaments have been pulled pretty much right up next to each other, but the myosin filament stayed right there in the same place. So that is that sliding filament theory, the idea that the myosin is somehow kind of pulling those actin filaments closer together. So it's the actin filaments that are doing the moving. So this is another way to look at it. The myosin is like the man in the center, and the myosin is pulling on the actin. And when we pull on the actin, we will see those bands that we saw in the cells actually move closer together. That's the process of contraction. So if we look at contraction of skeletal muscle as a whole, first of all, it's important to understand that muscle cells have an all or none response. It's not going to be just a little bit, it's all or none. So the whole muscle is able to have a graded response. There can be different degrees of shortening that we do get, but we do still consider this an all or none. So it either contracted or it didn't contract. The graded responses that we can have, these are going to be the result of changing the frequency of muscle stimulation, They can also be the result of changing the number of muscle cells that are actually being stimulated, so the ones that are participating in that particular contraction. If we look at it here, the nerve impulses, they're going to be delivered very rapidly to the muscle cells. And so they're delivered very rapidly, and that is going to result in there being no complete relaxation between the individual stimuli. So if we just have a twitch, then that's not going to be smooth at all. That's kind of a initial single nerve impulse being delivered. If we have a whole bunch of them, that's where we get this just continuous fluid muscle movement, and we call that a fused or complete tetanus. And that's what we see in this last one. You can see that there is this consistent spacing to the nerve impulses, and it's one impulse right after another, So that's the fused tetanus. The force of contraction that we get, that is going to depend on exactly how many cells are being stimulated with that particular nerve impulse. The muscles, they do require a source of ATP in order for their activity. So this ATP, it's not something that we can store long term. ATP is a short-term energy storage muscle. ATP is a short-term energy storage molecule, and that means that the cell must continuously work to produce the ATP. It has to generate it all of the time. There are different mechanisms that it uses to generate the ATP, and here's giving an overview of the three. Of course, we could go into a lot of detail in just the ATP production part of it, but that's not the topic here. We're focusing on the actions of the muscles and the working of the muscles. So here, I just want you to be familiar with the fact that we can get ATP produced by direct phosphorylation. It can be produced by an anaerobic pathway, such as fermentation. And then we also have aerobic pathways. Cellular respiration is the common one, and cellular respiration is really the most efficient, the most productive of the different methods that we could use to produce ATP. So that really is going to be the primary method that's used for generating that ATP.